Less than 1/3 of children in public schools are proficient in core studies. Welcome to Freedom Alive. It's no longer about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Alex Newman joins us on this episode to share more about how students are being dumbed down but bombarded with anti-God propaganda and why. I'm thankful to again be joined by our co-host, Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, we covered the history of public education with Alex on an earlier program, and now we're going to unpack government schools' attempt to indoctrinate children against faith, family, and freedom in the curriculum. It's really appalling.
It's actually shocking. And most people, when we look at our education, older generation, we think about what we experienced. And whatever we experienced, it's nothing like what our children or grandchildren or other children are experiencing today. And it's really a war zone that many of these children are walking into, an ideological war zone. There's bullying, there's all kinds of indoctrination regarding all kinds of ideologies that are contrary to our Judeo-Christian values, and also an attempt to drive wedges between parents and children. For example, in the LGBTQ agenda, there are lots of cases, sadly so, of children being pushed down this idea that they're just born in the wrong body, and the way to fix any of their mental stress, illness, health challenges that they're experiencing is to take puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and go through mutilating surgeries, and all things will be well. And then that is being hidden from parents. It's a very dangerous thing that's happening to our children, to our parents, and to our nation. And so Alex is going to unfold some of that. We're going to go into some more detail about what's happening in the public education system and what we can do about it. The first thing is to know what's happening so that we can take action.
Matt, I loved the point you made about the war zone. And for those at home, we cannot wait to equip you with this information so that you can make the best decisions for your family. But our Freedom Alert is next.
We must protect our children. The U.S. Supreme Court has now agreed to hear the Biden administration's challenge to a Tennessee law that protects children from harmful puberty blockers, hormones, and medically mutilating surgeries. The Biden administration is asking the justices to review a decision by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals that ruled the law was constitutional. The federal government argues the ban is sex-based discrimination and violates Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court's decision will affect bans in both Tennessee and Kentucky. The Constitution does not guarantee a right to harm children with experiments and irreversible procedures. The Sixth Circuit has rightly ruled that Tennessee and Kentucky are free to protect children from these procedures. Now the High Court has the chance to uphold these protections.
Up next, Matt's interview with Alex Newman.
Welcome to Freedom Alive. I want to welcome our very special guest, Alex Newman. He is the CEO of Liberty Sentinel Media and the author of this book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Welcome to Freedom Alive, Alex.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Alex, we have talked with you before about the history of education, coming from essentially the beginning of homeschool, if you will, private school, some supplementary type of education for special, specific science or math, for example, that maybe the parents needed some help on, some tutoring. And then this transformation after World War I to this public school system. The indoctrination then has been part of that public school system. And I want to talk to you today about some of this, what you found in your book and some of your research. You know, from some of the people that are watching this program, they're thinking of schools the way they used to be when they went to school. But what's happening actually in the public school? What is actually taking place today in our public schools on general basis across this country?
Well, the brief summary of it is your children are being sexualized. They're being indoctrinated into outrageous ideologies. They're being indoctrinated into a worldview that I would argue really comes from the pit of hell. They're being sexualized and they're being dumbed down. Right? The basic thing that parents in the modern era assume their children are doing at school. Learning how to read, write, and do math, they're not doing.
Well, so Alex, if I'm a viewer and I'm skeptical and say, well, that sounds like maybe California, but I live in a rural place of Georgia or some place of Florida. My school wouldn't be doing that. How would you address that across the country? Is this pretty systemic in schools no matter where you are?
Yeah, we need to understand that we no longer have locally controlled schools. There is this pervasive myth out there that my school is okay.
My school's fine,
right.
Because I mean, obviously the parent wouldn't want to say, I'm sending my kid to this war zone
right.
that's under-educating them and challenging their values. You always want to think, I'm sending my kid to a school that's pretty good.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we have not just a nationalized system now, and I wouldn't even call it an education system anymore. Miseducation even would be too kind. But we now have a globalized system. And this really started becoming more obvious like 1960s. We talked in our previous episode about the Supreme Court stepping in. That was really the first major federal intrusion that was overt into the government school system, where they banned prayer, they banned the Bible. Then just a few years later, Congress passed the ESEA Act, where they started opening up the doors to federal funding, which of course helped hijack control. Today, we're at the point where they're open about this. We've got the Common Core now, despite what you may have heard. It is almost certainly in your state. Sometimes they've rebranded it, Indiana state standards, but they just copied and pasted. It's 95% the same thing. And now people don't realize we're moving very rapidly toward a globalized system where UNESCO is playing a larger and larger role. The UN already has what they call the World Core Curriculum that they have said publicly should be taught in every school to every child in the world. And in fact, the Common Core people bought ads to brag about how Common Core was going to align America's educational system with the international standards.
Is that right?
I've got their ads. They were bragging about this. This isn't Alex, this is them.
So for someone who's heard about Common Core, give us a little overview of what it really does. What is the difference, say, for example, in a Common Core math versus some traditional math course?
Well, I'll just defer to the only math expert they put on their Common Core validation committee, Dr. James Milgram of Stanford University. And they hand-selected these experts, by the way, because they assumed they would just be a nice rubber stamp and put their seal of approval on there. He refused to sign off on the Common Core math standards because he said they're written to reflect very low expectations. In some cases, he said they're actually based on incorrect math, which people struggle to wrap their head around that. We mandated standards in all 50 states that are based on incorrect math? Yes, that's exactly what they did. Now, the federal government knows all this. They hired an organization called CSAIL to do an in-depth study of the effects of Common Core on children's learning. And 7 years into it, they said there were significant negative effects. They said we still hadn't reached the bottom. The trends were still going down. And you can look at the U.S. Department of Education's own data. Right? Ignore me. Some of you don't even know who I am. The U.S. Department of Education, every 2 years, they do what they call the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They take a representative sample of students in government schools, and their data shows that less than 1/3 of the victims of these institutions are even proficient, which, it sounds like they're proficient. They're not even at a basic level from where you or I would assume would be proficiency. Less than 1/3 of these students are even proficient in any of the core subjects: English, math, science, history, civics. So we have a catastrophe now where we're graduating millions of kids from high school who literally cannot read their high school diploma, and this would not be tolerated for 1 second in any other industry. And yet the government schools have the nerve to tell us we just need to give them more money and they need more time with our children. It's outrageous.
It's really sad how these schools, and some states obviously are complicit because they're mandating these kinds of standards, experiment on children, and they don't tell the parents really what's happening. I was an experiment, if you will, moving from the phonics method of teaching to the look-see, like see Dick and run, see Jane run. Of course, I didn't know, my mom didn't know that was a transformation of learning, and I'm learning by sight as opposed to sound. So, I have an assistant. She's retired now, but she worked with me for 25 years. She had a high school education. I had a college education, a master's degree, and a law degree, and she could outspell me because she was on phonics and I was on look-see. I didn't realize that I was part of the experiment. Common Core is taking that to another whole level because it's not just on spelling, but it's also on everything.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. In fact, before this book, I co-wrote another book on that very issue called Crimes of the Educators with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, who actually dedicated 60 years of his life just to that one issue, the reading problem. And under Common Core, they still perpetuate this quackery. I mean, we've known literally since the 1840s that method doesn't work. Horace Mann was the first one to institutionalize this. He tried it out in the schools in Boston. And the schoolmasters in these fledgling government schools, they wrote this brilliant critique. Sam actually published it as an appendix in the New Illiterates in 1973, where they said this method that Mr. Mann has proposed is neither called for nor sustained by sound reasoning, which was their very diplomatic way of saying this is totally idiotic, it doesn't work, we're not doing it anymore. So that was resurrected by John Dewey. It was pushed out throughout the whole country to the point where after World War II it became ubiquitous, and it was exposed many times along the way, right? Rudolf Flesch in 1955 did Why Johnny Can't Read, and the reason why, as he put it, was because the teaching of reading in all the schools and in all the textbooks flies in the face of common sense and is contrary to all sound reasoning.
You know, we talked about this on a previous program with you. It just doesn't make sense. You know, early in our development of our nation, we were the most illiterate nation on the planet.
In all of history.
In all of history. And you would want to have a literate society, but then there's been this attempt to dumb down society, and you've talked about that in your book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, and on our previous program with you. But now we even have it in the modern manifestation of Common Core, UNESCO. We'll talk about that a little bit more. It seems contrary to just intuition that you would want to use education to dumb down people. What's the goal behind this?
I think the really simple explanation, the essence of what's going on here is they wanted a fundamental transformation of the United States. They could not have a highly literate, very Christian, free, incredibly prosperous society leading the world that was based on these fundamental biblical principles like God gave you a right to life when he said thou shalt not murder. God gave you a right to property when he said thou shalt not steal. You cannot build the type of collectivist utopia that these people want if you have a society like America had prior to the advent of government education. So a lot of people have their own different motives, and the vast majority of the people who are unfortunately dumbing down our children with this quackery don't understand, right? They went to get an education degree and they were taught that this is the way it's done, and so they think they're experts and the parents don't know. But at the highest levels, you know, when John Dewey graduated all these kids from his experimental school, they couldn't read. And today you look at the federal government's own data on this, 50% of Americans are in the bottom two categories, which means they actually are not reading properly. They're trying to do the look-say method where they're trying to decipher things based on the whole word being a symbol instead of a collection of symbols. So this is catastrophic, but you cannot transform a free and prosperous Christian society into their vision without first dumbing down and transforming the kids.
So going back to that other question, the viewer that's watching, and you say, well, you know, I live in a more conservative rural area. My school's not like that because they're not having that LGBTQ Pride Month. They're not doing the rainbow flags. They're not pushing all these other ideologies and the false pronouns. The problem is even if they're not, the whole system has become problematic from the very foundation. The roots of it are problematic. So they're getting other kinds of things that are undermining our Judeo-Christian values and not giving them the kind of education that they need.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it begins with a worldview, right? We keep redrawing the battle lines. Now we say, well, just stop telling my kindergartners that they should be castrated, and then we'll be okay. We keep moving the line.
I think, it's worldview that's really, really critical. And when they're undermining that worldview, because they're still going to be having an assumption that's not a Judeo-Christian worldview assumption.
Precisely.
And when you build education on that idea, a secularist, humanist assumption worldview, everything else grows out of that. You mentioned UNESCO, and I want to get from there to some of the LGBTQ issues, the things that kids are facing, you know, suicide and bullying, abortion within the public schools as well. But talk about UNESCO. You mentioned this global push, Common Core, and now you have this world organization under the United Nations, UNESCO.
Yeah, so UNESCO was a critical component of this agenda very early on. So NEA where John Dewey was actually made the honorary life president, of course. Who else would you make the honorary life president? And so they were advocating, even before UNESCO was born, for what they called a global school board. They wanted an international organization that would standardize education globally. And that was born with UNESCO. Now, to take it back to this worldview issue, I mentioned earlier Julian Huxley, the first guy they put in charge. He was actually the leader of the Eugenics Society. He was also the leader of the Humanist Association. So him and John Dewey shared that in common. Now, we need to be very, very clear here on this worldview issue. Jesus Christ himself is quoted twice in the Gospels saying, whoever's not with me is against me. Mm-hmm. And so, Harvard University had it right in their original rules and precepts. They said that every student should understand that the main purpose of his life and studies is to glorify God. Yeah. So it's really a fundamental difference in what are we even educating children for. The Christian understanding is we're educating them so that they can know and glorify God. The genesis of the system that we have today was actually to uproot that and to fully transform it. So that today you ask somebody, what is the purpose of education? Well, so my kid can get a good job, so that they can have a good college degree, so they can make a lot of money. So we've gone really, really wrong there. And UNESCO is helping to lead this charge, not just here, but around the world. They're now working, for example, to institutionalize the whole word quackery and reading all over the world. They're working to promote this idea of the World Core Curriculum. And I'll just give you a sense of how bad this is. I know we're not going to have endless time to go too deep down this rabbit hole. But the guy who wrote the World Core Curriculum, his name was Robert Mueller. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the UN, so second in command. He's called the father of global education. I have a lot of his books, and they're very deeply involved in the New Age and the occult. And in the foreword to the teacher's manual for the World Core Curriculum, he says that this is actually based on, in his words, the teachings of Alice Bailey in her books and the Tibetan teacher Jewel Kuhl. And to most people, including to most teachers in the United States, that won't mean anything. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about Alice Bailey, probably enough to determine what's going on here. She was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Oh. It's a true story. And she claimed to be communicating with these spiritual entities, including this Tibetan teacher, Jewel Kuhl. She called them ascended masters. She claimed that she was channeling them and writing these books. And so if the global education system is based on our teachings, and the father of global education says that it is, we ought to know what she said. So I've got one of her books. It's called Education in the New Age, written with the alleged assistance of these spiritual entities. And of course, if you read your Bible, it's not ascended masters, it's demonic. She says that the goal needs to be turning children into global citizens for the emergence of a world federation and what she describes as a world brain. And she says we're going to get this by fusing Marxism with neo-scholasticism, using the chosen cooperative methods of John Dewey. So we're back full circle now to John Dewey. These people are 3 steps ahead of us. We're fighting the mutilation of children in kindergarten. They're way past that. They're already plotting 3 moves ahead.
Wow. Speaking of the mutilation of children in kindergarten, talk about what's going on with the LGBT agenda in the public schools.
It is ubiquitous now. And to go back to your earlier question about, well, is that happening in every? Yes, it's happening in every district. So a few years ago, I pulled off the California Department of Education's website some documents, the gender transition plan, things like this, where they were giving these kids these documents. So what are your pronouns? What gender do you identify as? And what name should we call you? And by the way, do your parents know? Because if they don't, we'll conceal this from them. So I was giving lectures across the country on this, and I actually gave a lecture in a very conservative county here. Every elected official is Republican, Flagler County, and one of the members of the school board came to the talk, and I had been talking about that document. He said, Alex, those same documents are right here in Flagler County.
Yeah.
So
Utah, it's not just California. It's not just San Francisco.
It's everywhere. And Utah, too. Utah is one of the most conservative states, politically speaking, in the United States. Every statewide office essentially is held by Republicans, supermajority Republican in both houses of the legislature. And so I was there in 2020, and I had a meeting with some of the members of the state school board, and they gave me documents. This is 2020. This is 4 years ago. I'm sure it's worse now, showing how many children were getting prescriptions for what they call gender transition. So little girls being prescribed testosterone, getting ready for surgical mutilation. From 2015 to 2020, there was a 10,000% increase among underage girls being prepared for these gender transitions. That's happening because they're being indoctrinated to believe this madness in the schools.
Wow. And then, of course, you have abortion that's being pushed as well.
Without parental consent,
without parental consent. So don't let your parents know that you're going to get an abortion. Take the pill to get this abortion, mifepristone or whatever it might be that they're going to give. And then these puberty blockers, I mean, we've seen this happen across the country where these parents, after a few years, they realize something's going on with their kid, and they realize that somebody in the school is actually keeping this information from them, that they're giving different pronouns to their child, calling their girl a boy, addressing them with a different name, different pronouns, and maybe even referring them out to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then eventually mutilating surgeries. And then when the parent ultimately finds out and objects, then they bring in the Child Protective Services and say, you know what, you're not affirming your child, and if you don't, this child's going to commit suicide, and that's child abuse.
Yep, and we have seen this time after time after time. I actually broke a story some years ago of a mom in Colorado. I've gotten to know her pretty well now. Her name is Erin Lee. They told her 12-year-old daughter, why don't you stay after school for an art club? So she stays after school for an art club, 12 years old. Turns out it wasn't actually an art club. It was a GSA, I think it's Genders and Sexualities Alliance or whatever. And they tell this little girl and a whole bunch of other little girls, if you're not fully comfortable in your own body, I mean, these are little girls going through puberty, you're transgender. So have some transgender flags. By the way, your parents aren't safe, but I'm safe. Here's my cell phone number. You can contact me instead of your parents. And so this little girl, doing what little girls should do, she told her mom, hey, they told me I'm transgender. I think I'm transgender. So the mom and the dad decided to pull her out of the school. And just like you said, we've got the emails from district officials. We've got to send the CPS. We've got to do a wellness check. They're not being affirming. So thankfully, the parents stood up and the little girl is fine now. She's speaking out. They've made a documentary called Art Club. But this is the reality of what's happening. This is a conservative community in Colorado. It's ubiquitous now across the country, and the damage that's being done to our children is permanent and it's incalculable.
And like any Marxist country or ideology, they want to divide people in different classes. And so you also talk about critical race theory. What's happening in the critical race theory within our schools is they're dividing people, and instead of eliminating racism, they're actually increasing and exacerbating racism.
Yeah, and this is a strategy that was pioneered many generations ago by revolutionary communists. It's actually exactly the same thing that Chairman Mao was doing in the brainwash camps for children in communist China, except instead of race, they used different characteristics. So just like here, they divided everybody into two categories, oppressor and oppressed. In China, you had the red class and the black class. The red classes were, the landless peasants, the workers, the communist revolutionaries, and the black classes, those were the bad ones. That was people whose parents maybe had a little bit of land, maybe their parents owned a small shop or whatever. And so they would tell these little kids from the black classes, you need to apologize for your privilege. We need to do a struggle session. You need to turn your parents in. Same process, because as Jesus said, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. This is to destroy the United States, has nothing to do with racial justice or anything like that. It's a means to an end, and that end is revolution.
So we have these schools. What do we do with them? How do we figure out what's going on, and how do we make a difference as a community?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and people have been working on this now for generations. Conservatives have thrown millions, maybe billions of dollars at school reform efforts, and unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the battle lines keep getting moved. And every generation, this has been going on now for 4, maybe 5 generations, every generation says, wow, the schools are way worse than when I was a kid. What's going on? And they don't have a reference point, so they think, well, when I was a kid, it was good. Now it's bad. If they had a reference point, they'd realize that what they received was terrible. In fact, back in 1983, before I was even born, Ronald Reagan's commission on the National Commission on Excellence in Education concluded that if a foreign power had done this to us, this education system, we would have viewed it as an act of war. Right? Yeah. So even if you were educated back in the 70s or 80s, it was a disaster. And so for parents out there, I mean, I don't know what to tell you other than pull your children out. Look at the textbooks that they're using. They're all based on an erroneous point of view. They're all based on this kind of humanist theology, philosophy. And when you break that worldview down, right? You can read the Humanist Manifesto. It basically, the unstated assumption is that you're God and I'm God, and we're all little gods, and that we can determine for ourselves what's right and wrong because there is no real God. And that sounds like a new religion, but it's actually the oldest lie in the book. It comes out of Genesis chapter 3 when Satan says, ye shall be as gods, etc. So I would say, even beyond just the details, the transgender stuff, which is now ubiquitous, all of it, look at the fundamental presuppositions that underlie all of it. And what you'll find is that it is fundamentally incompatible with a biblical worldview, with a Christian worldview. And to go back to the words of Jesus, if you're not with me, you're against me. Mm-hmm. Nobody today with any sense would argue that the public schools are with Christ. That leaves one option. And so parents, if you decide to leave your children in there, recognize that they are being absolutely saturated from the moment they walk in there in a worldview that is not neutral, that is not secular, that is on every critical point hostile to the Word of God, to Jesus Christ, and to the Creator of the heavens and the earth.
Well, thank you, Alex, for being a courageous voice, a very well thought out, read and researched voice for this critical issue. So pray about the future of your children, your grandchildren, not just in K through 12, but where they might go for higher education as well. That's a very critical time in their lives as well. And it's just as important to find a place that believes God and puts God central from the very first moments of education all the way through all of your higher education. So thank you for joining us on Freedom Alive.
It's an honor. Thank you so much.
Matt, let's talk about the issue of worldview. At one time, at the origin, we were the most literate nation of the world ever, right? With a goal of our education system to glorify God. And then we have this incalculable damage done by this worldview that is secular, humanist, completely contrary to where we started.
Mm-hmm. Well, the scriptures say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that word fear is not just by being trembly, but it is respect, awe, fearful of the Lord, just understanding who the Lord is. That is the beginning of wisdom. And when you take the Lord out of education, that which is to give you wisdom actually does exactly the opposite. And so worldview is so critical. We can't keep doing the same thing because we've seen that it has been hijacked. The public education has been hijacked for a reason. And we see the results that it's producing. We can't keep doing the same thing and expect different results.
Mm-hmm. As always, we are delighted to bring the truth on every episode of Freedom Alive. And there were really a few points that stood out to me for those of us as parents and grandparents. Be informed. There's so much to learn about this hijacking point that Matt speaks about. Be engaged. Thirdly is fight on behalf of your family. Make the best possible decisions for your children and your grandchildren. And then lastly, know that there are options. There are fantastic options to this public school system that we've all known throughout all of our life. There are wonderful options. In closing, remember Galatians 5, verse 1, which says, "It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery." Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. Join us here next time. You'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.